In this episode, Paige and I discuss dysfunctional fat cells and the impact they have on skin appearance. Now, this is not something you will have heard about from dermatologists. For reasons that I can't understand, dermatologists are completely clueless about the role of fat cells in the appearance of the skin. And yes, fat cells are critical to both the sagginess of the skin, volume loss. Now, fat cell dysfunction is principally caused by inflammation, and that shouldn't be surprising. And the two main sources of inflammation for your skin's fat cells are sun exposure and having a body composition that's overly fat, because that body composition will bloat the fat cells and they will become inflamed. Now, the good news is both sources of inflammation, both the sun and the bloated fat cells, can be addressed at home without products, without expensive procedures, and you can do it in a long-term, constructive fashion. This episode will give you a valuable insight for how to take care of your skin that you won't hear from anywhere else. Enjoy.
I am extremely unversed in today's topic. I'm eager to hear what you have to say about it.
So that would be you and almost everyone else. In fact, the idea inflammation affects fat cells or that fat cells are important to the metabolism of the body is so foreign that there was this guy who's like one of the biggest nutrition nerds, Dr. Michael Greger, who wrote a book, How Not to Diet. And he's got this big organization. He wrote this 600-page book, and he spent half a page on the role of fat cells. It was completely underestimates the role of fat cell function. So we need to care about fat cell functionality, right? And when have you ever heard anyone talk about that?
Never in my life.
So it's not surprising that this is not a topic that you don't understand yet.
Yet.
The
hope is that I do by the end of this conversation. But before we dive into inflammation and dysfunctional fat cells, can you explain what you mean by dysfunctional fat? Because I have no idea what we're talking about.
Yeah. So think about fat cells as being either like a super sophisticated Amazon fulfillment center, but then a complexity that's maybe tenfold higher than the Amazon facility. Or another analogy that I was thinking of is like our banking system. The fat cells hold the currency, which is energy, and they're responsible for understanding whether to store energy, whether to release energy, and they're in contact with all the other tissues and organs in the body. And once you think about it that way, you can't think of fat cells as being dumb.
Yeah, I mean, that analogy almost makes them seem like they're in control.
They're not in control, but they're a very important team member. It's like nothing happens in the body without the fat cells. And so their dysfunction is very much impacts all parts of the body. And it's so amazing how little we know about it. So, for example, fat cell dysfunction and the skin, right? We talked about this a little bit in our last episode. So when fat cells become dysfunctional, they cause the fibroblasts in the skin to stop making collagen and elastin, like almost a 70% reduction. And so
don't like that.
What?
I said, I don't like that.
Yeah. So that's just with the skin, right? And so think about the other organs and what the dysfunction means. Now, we don't really know that much about fat cell dysfunction, but we know, for example, that fat cells become too big, right? They become bloated. And when they become bloated, they stop doing their basic functions, storing energy and releasing energy very well. They can still sort of do it, but not very well. And so one of the things they do is they leak lipids. So usually you need a very elaborate signal to get fat cells to release lipids. But when they're bloated, they're just releasing lipids just willy-nilly all the time. And this contributes to heart disease. This is the link between obesity and heart disease. It has all to do with fat cell dysfunction. So you can take an obese mouse and they have fully functioning, healthy fat cells, they will have no cardiovascular disease. They will be able to exercise as well as the skinny mice. They won't die prematurely. And so fat cell fitness is really important. And not surprisingly, since inflammation is a major disruptor of human health, inflammation also disrupts fat cell fitness.
Well, I was going to say, how does inflammation contribute to this?
Well, the part that we know the best is that inflammation reduces the rate of new fat cell formation. And so we need a steady supply of new fat cells to replace ones that are dead to maintain, a healthy size, because it's like suitcases, right? If you only have a few suitcases and you need to pack, your house, those suitcases are going to be stuffed and bloated. So you need a lot of these fat cells just in terms of being able to store lipid effectively. And inflammation prevents both stages of new fat cell formation. So this is a process called adipogenesis, and there are two stages. First stage is stem cells convert to a cell type called a pre-adipocyte, which actually looks like a fibroblast. It's a cell that can still change its fate depending on other signals. But that's the first step. The stem cells become pre-adipocytes, and then in the second step, the pre-adipocytes convert to become mature fat cells. And inflammation, and particularly TNF-alpha driven inflammation, inhibits both stages. And so you have a really significant reduction in the number of new cells that are being made. And that leads to the cells become bloated. And then it becomes a vicious cycle because the bloated cells, they themselves become inflamed, right? They start changing their behavior. Instead of making sort of good things that the body needs, they start making inflammatory cytokines. And in fact, something that I just learned in preparing for this episode that I didn't know is not only can inflammation prevent new fat cells from forming, but it can turn those pre-adipocytes into active immune cells, which I had no idea.
And is this published?
Of course. Yeah. Nothing.
The video description is published.
Yeah. Nothing we discuss here is unpublished,
Okay.
except for when I say this is one of my crazy ideas and there's no support for it.
Okay. So what types of inflammation are we talking about specifically? And how can we avoid these types of inflammation?
Yeah. So I'm going to talk about just three in particular that affect skin health. I'd say the three most common are sun exposure, exercise, and having a body structure where the fat component is too high. So it's not just your weight and not just your BMI, but the percentage of your body that is comprised of fat. So let's start with the first one, right? It's incredibly complicated to explain how UV rays are converted into inflammation. There are so many different molecular mechanisms at work, but suffice it to say that this is very well established now, and that the UV rays induce a variety of reactions in the skin, barrier changes to reactive species development and countermeasures to release of prostaglandins. And so, not surprisingly, right, the inflammation that you get from sun exposure also is one of the major contributors to fat loss in the face, and specifically right here under the eye.
The hollow under the eye.
For two reasons. One, this is published. The skin is most thin under the eye, and so the extent of the damage caused by UV ray exposure is more pronounced under the eye. The second one is an Yvonne hypothesis. The under eye area is the only area in the face that's concave, right? And so my hypothesis is that the sun rays bounce in here and they can bounce around and they can do more damage than in a convex area where they're more likely to bounce off without hitting the skin again. We know when we look at even people in their 20s, if they have any volume loss at all, it'll be right in here.
Absolutely. I had many friends in my 20s that I had volume loss under one eye, which is, I don't know how that would support your theory, but I had one eye with significant volume loss.
Was it could be driver's side, or
It was my driver's side, this
yeah,
side.
it could be driver's side.
Actually, that's
Um,
always
but that's the good news, right? So now we shift to what can you do about that?
okay.
Well, you can wear sunglasses, right? Or you can wear a hat. So
Sure.
once you realize that this is the area that really is going to be the most damaged by sun exposure, just protect that area. It makes it so much easier because when you're thinking about putting sunscreen all over your face, all over your body, come on, you need to apply it so freaking often for it to do
Yeah.
any good that people, just don't do it.
I'm a little anti sunglasses to be honest with you, just because I'm so pro circadian rhythm
So hat, so hat,
regulation. So
yeah,
yeah, I think the best way I mean this is again just, I'm not a professional by any means in any of these areas, but I have found for me to sleep my best, feel my best, I don't really wear sunglasses and I just wear a huge hat.
hat. Yes,
And
yes.
I don't wear a sunscreen diligently as I used to, only because for the reasons like you mentioned, it's I think a physical barrier is actually like the best. And if I do get sun exposure, which I do love the sun, I'm very pro sun. I just try not to get it when the UV is high. So I'm
Yeah,
looking for that UV to be 1 to 2 when I'm out in the sun for a long time. Yeah.
yeah. And I'm actually going to do two episodes.
Hmm.
One is going to cover how you can use diet to provide protection against the sun.
Hmm.
And another one that's going to discuss what can you do after sun exposure to minimize the damage. Because
I want to hear this episode. I need this
yeah,
episode.
yeah, no, I
Okay.
need to do a bit of research, but I think that definitely the one, like how can you use diet to
Yeah.
enhance protection is like a clear cut. No one really talks about it as much because I don't think anyone wants to sort of seem like they're advocating against sunscreen.
Yeah.
And because it's
Yeah.
like,
Slippery slope.
if you do that as a dermatologist, I think you're banned from the
100%. Yes, absolutely.
American Association
Yeah.
of Dermatologists.
Hmm.
So that's sun, right?
Hmm.
And it's actually, it's pretty good news because it's really localized and you can take care of it without crazy stuff.
Yeah.
The second one, let's talk about exercise because
Yeah.
that's really interesting because people will say, well, isn't exercise anti-inflammatory?
What?
Yes, it is in the long run because it maintains the health of your body. It is anti-inflammatory because it reduces the size of your fat cells in the long run.
Hmm.
Exercise is anti-inflammatory. But in the 1 to 4 hours after you exercise, there is a spike of inflammation, and it's a window that's about 4 hours long.
Hmm.
And your inflammatory markers are increased, I'd say, three to fourfold over your baseline. So, how significant is this, right?
Yeah.
I don't think it's that significant. I think it's only significant if the dose of this inflammation is really high. And by that, I mean if you're exercising 4 or 5 times a week or 3 or 4 times a week in a high intensity mode. And
Is
it,
this
yeah,
is this why some really high performing athletes seem to have a lot of volume loss in their face? It's
yeah,
just a thing I've noticed.
yeah, absolutely. This was like confusing me for the longest time because you'd see these male weightlifters, right?
Yeah.
Like, like super healthy people. These are people eating a super healthy diet. They're getting tons of protein and their skin is just hanging off their face. They've got like whatever, 4%, 5% body fat. Their skin is hanging off their face. And I'm like, how is that possible? Right.
Yeah.
And then I finally realized it's two things probably. They probably don't have enough fat cells
Hmm.
because of the exercise induced pauses. So the exercise creates the inflammation. During that window, it's harder for fat cells to regenerate. So if you've got a 4 hour window, you know, every other day or, 4 or 5 times a week, it's going to add up.
Yeah.
So
I think.
that's one. The other is because they have so few, the remaining ones are big.
Hmm.
And so those turn off the collagen elastin production and hence the weak, saggy skin. But here's the great thing about exercise. You know if you have it. It's not something you have to worry about, right? If you don't see like these grooves, like not directly under the eye, but if
I know those. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, if you don't have these grooves here,
You
you're
don't have to,
fine.
you're fine. Yeah,
Keep exercising the way you're exercising.
yeah.
Now, if you have the grooves, right, what
Mm-hmm.
can you do? I have a couple of, sort of very easy suggestions. Take a cold shower after your exercise, right? 5 minutes, 10 minutes, cold plunge. Doesn't have to be a cold plunge because that's hard to arrange, but
Yeah,
just
that's fine.
5 minutes of cold shower, very anti-inflammatory.
Dunk your face in ice.
Dunk your face in ice, that's even easier, but it's pleasant. Actually, once you get used to it, it feels good. And so that's, I think, one modality that I've always encouraged that has no downside. And then the other is I've discovered one substance that is anti-inflammatory and not anti-dipogenic, and
Okay.
that is tart cherry juice.
Really? I drink that at night sometimes in my sleepy girl mocktail because it helps produce melatonin, yeah?
I
Naturally.
don't know. I didn't know about that, but it's really anti-inflammatory. And unlike most polyphenols, like green tea,
Mm-hmm.
it is not anti-adipogenic. Now I'm going to do a separate episode on polyphenols being anti-adipogenic because I'm not sure. I know that they're anti-adipogenic.
Really?
Yes, I don't know if you get enough of a concentration in the body for the anti-adipogenic activity to
Sure.
be relevant. So I
Okay.
need to do a deep dive there.
Please let me know. I'm taking a high, like a polyphenol powder every day at this point.
I will. I'll take a look. That's important because dose matters because
Yeah.
you can't just say something's anti-adipogenic without looking at the dose. So I have to look at the dose there.
Okay.
So then the most difficult one is having body composition that's too high in fat. Now, I should know what that level is. I don't know, right? I'm going to be honest. I don't know. Don't know the body composition of fat that creates the inflammatory cytokines and induces this vicious cycle of reduced adipogenesis, larger fat cells getting larger.
Well, let's clarify this a little bit because when you were talking about this, you specifically said earlier this doesn't have to do with BMI or your weight. So I'm a tiny bit confused here as to what you said.
Well, so weight and BMI are approximations, right?
Sure.
But neither really talks about the fat component, right? Which is separate, right? Which is
Mhm.
like what percent composition you can be skinny and have a high composition of body fat, or
Sure.
you
Yes.
or you can be heavy and
Hmm.
have a low composition of body fat. So it's not the BMI per se, but sometimes you can use that as a rough approximation. I want to try to get to a more informed statistic, but let's just, for today's purposes, let's consider a rough body composition that's too much fat. I
And
don't know.
too much fat being a negative thing,
A,
yes?
a negative
For
because
fat cell function. Okay.
for fat cell function because the
Yeah.
fat cells become too big, they become pro-inflammatory,
Okay.
and then it sort of starts a vicious cycle.
See.
And I want to be precise on what this is, but I actually think this affects a large percentage of the population. Even people who are, like me, who are 5, 10 pounds overweight, I think have fat cells that are too big.
Okay.
This is just a thought. So what can you do, right? What can you do?
What can you do?
I think there's a lot that you can do. And I think that the encouraging thing is we need to shift the focus away from weight, right? Because people are so focused on weight and they're so focused on immediate weight reduction.
Mhm.
And I want to shift the focus to body composition long term, right? So this is a long term play, right? This is not like I'm going to lose 20 pounds in a month.
Yep.
That does not sustain. You want to adopt a series of habits that's going to improve your body composition towards muscle and away from fat. And that is also a positive loop because as you build muscle, your body burns more fat
Yes.
and you feel better about yourself. So then you're more likely to go out and exercise, do little things. Not even like when I say exercise, I just mean walk or let's go out. It's a beautiful day.
And I just want to just recap in a
Okay.
digestible way because 2 and 3 are almost a little conflicting, but I just want to clarify that exercise is positive, but in its most like intense forms. And if it's happening extremely frequently, you can experience maybe fat loss in your face,
Yeah. Well,
etc.
think about the dose, right?
Yes.
I appreciate you pointing out this like seemingly inconsistency in
Yeah.
this conflict. But think about what we said with exercise and dose. You really need a high dose of exercise for it to be visibly anti-dipogenic.
Yes.
And that dose is not one that normal people.
Like running 15 miles or whatever,
Right. This is
Yeah.
not, if you don't have the grooves, right?
Yeah, you're fine.
You're not at risk for that, right?
Okay.
So there's a big area of dose. And also here's the thing, it's the anti-dipogenic effect of exercise seems to be dose dependent, right? So a high intensity walking will raise your TNF alpha level to
Yes, it
two
will. Yeah.
times to 2 times the level of low intensity walking. So even within the effect, you have a dose effect. So exercise, moderate, regular exercise, tiny bits of exercise. Like, here's the other thing, and this also deserves a complete episode. Sedentary activity is inflammatory, independent of not exercising. So sitting around is bad, not because you're not exercising, but because sitting around is bad, right?
Yeah.
So we have just two things, sun and healthy weight, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's it. And if we take care of those two things, right?
We're going to be in a better position than most.
Our
Yeah.
skin is that's 80, 80 to 90% of having healthy skin.
Yeah. I mean, I really want you to do an episode on lasers and other heat-based modalities because I feel really lucky that I haven't done anything drastic in that department because I've been so, I love the fat in my face. I want to keep it. So anytime, I do so much research before I do anything on my face. And when I hear horror stories about fat loss from heat-based modalities and different lasers, I'm very reluctant to do them. And
Well, lasers are the third rail of dermatology, right? It's like used to be the most practiced procedure, I think, by dermatologists. Like, there was a laser for everything, right?
Mhm.
And so it's not something you take on lightly. And I've known that it will take a lot of work to unearth the damage that lasers cause, because I'm sure that much of it is hidden.
Yeah,
But yes, by the end of the year, I will have enough time to really dig into the lasers and do an episode about the lasers.
that'll be great. Yeah. Well, this has been fascinating. I feel like I learned a lot.
Yeah. So now just even thinking about fat cell functionality and how we need the fat cells,
Yeah, we
we
want to
need
support them.
we need them. They are nodes in our banking network that are very important. And so I hope that just that thought will keep people from doing procedures and injections that are fat melting, right?
Yeah.
Don't, whenever you hear fat melting, turn away.
Yeah, yeah. Or
Paige, well, that was awesome.
thank you so much.